Thank you. So sort of what we're going to talk about today are some challenges that neurodiverse people face in the learning environment, whether that's a virtual or a face-to-face experience, and sort of how you can design your learning experience to help them succeed in their learning journey. We're going to talk a little bit about what neurodiversity is, some general principles that we want to kind of keep in mind when we're thinking about it, and then some of the broad categories of neurodiversity that exist. After we do that, we'll jump into specific design strategies for those categories. And something I want to just kind of note up front that we're aware of, when we're talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about functionally structural differences in the brain. Neurons are wired differently, electrical signals take different paths, some areas of the brain work harder or work better than others. I'm not really going to focus that much on sort of the mechanics of neurodiversity and how the different areas of the brain work for different types of neurodiversity. I'm not a brain expert, but I do think it's important just to realize and understand that that's what we're talking about and that all our brains are unique. So what is neurodiversity? And really, it's just the understanding that our brains are all wired differently and that those differences in brain structure and layout aren't inherently bad or worse. They're just different. That conditions like ADHD, dyslexia, autism, et cetera, are just natural variations of the human genome. And the first place I want to start is with understanding that we're all different. Like we talk about sometimes neurodiversity in these different categories. We give them names like autism and ADHD, but really at the end of the day, we all perceive and understand the world differently. We all process it in our own way. And it's important to understand that because of this sort of infinite diversity in how we process the world, there's no way you'll ever end up with a perfect learning experience. There's no way you'll be able to design a course that will be perfectly fit for everyone, that'll be accessible to people with all different types of neurodiversity. And one of the reasons that is because often something that we design that might be an accommodation or a helpful design choice for one learner might end up being a barrier to another learner, or even something that might be a helpful design choice for a person at one part in the day might end up being a barrier at a different time of day. Frequency of communication is a great example here. For an individual who has difficulty remembering things, a design choice where you give lots of reminders about an upcoming assignment could be really helpful. But for someone who has trouble focusing, those sort of incessant and often reminders could end up just being a distraction to them and making their learning more difficult. Particularly if that reminder comes at an inopportune time, like in the middle of another class, they might miss it, or it might distract them from what they're currently doing. And because neurodiversity is so broad, there's no way we can really know or measure the full extent as to how it affects someone. Oftentimes we aren't even really aware of our own neurodiversity. And so we can't design an experience that will work for everyone. For example, if you were to take a room full of people and ask them to close their eyes and imagine an apple, most people would be able to do that to some extent. You say visualize an apple, and that for some people it would be maybe sort of a fuzzy image of an apple. For others, they could close their eyes and immediately imagine that apple in 4K high definition with bright, shiny skin and color. And one of the things I learned a few years ago is that there's a condition called aphantasia, where you simply have no ability to visualize anything in your mind's eye at all. You just can't summon that visual picture. And this blew my mind when I learned it, because that's me. I have that condition. I can't picture anything in my mind. For my entire life, when people said visualize this thing in your brain, I always thought they were speaking metaphorically. So I was shocked that there were people in the world that could actually visualize things in their mind. That's just kind of an example of how we're often not aware of our own neurodiversity. And the opposite of that is I have a friend whose memory is completely visual. He remembers things by basically playing movies back in his mind, but he has absolutely no inner monologue at all. He can't talk to himself in his brain, which is a completely foreign idea to me, because sort of words and concepts are primarily the way that I think. So we all process and evaluate the world a little bit differently, even if we don't know it. And the other piece that I want us to understand while we're talking about designing for neurodiversity is that it's a little bit different than a lot of the other categories of accessibility that we often talk about. When we're talking about things like designing for hard of hearing learners or for learners with a visual impairment, oftentimes we're talking about doing things to the code behind the content. We're talking about adding things like alternative text to images, using proper heading styles so that document structures are navigable by a screen reader, making sure there aren't mouse traps on the screen, things like that. Things that are done sort of behind the content that are often an extra step or an extra piece to making sure your content's accessible. When we're talking about designing for neurodiversity, a lot of it is actually framed around how we present the content itself rather than the code behind it. We ask ourselves questions like, how many items should I display on the screen at one time? Have I broken this content down into appropriately sized chunks? What methods and strategies am I using to communicate with the learner? Am I providing enough time to complete this task? How am I helping the learner manage their distractions? And so it's these types of questions that we typically focus on. Now, obviously, there are some things that you can do sort of in the code and behind the content to help design for neurodiversity as well. And you can apply these content strategies in other areas of accessibility. But our focus is really going to be more today on sort of the design side of things than the back-end code type of things. And then one of the other ways of reframing our thinking about neurodiversity, particularly from a design standpoint, is not always focusing simply on shoring up the weaknesses or the challenges that a neurodiverse individual might have, but also providing experiences and allowing them to lean into their strengths. I've talked in the past about how in the design world, we try to shy away from terms like good or bad and rather sort of think in terms of affordances and constraints. And that extends not only to what we are designing, but also the people we are designing for. As we'll explore a little bit later, we'll talk about people with how people with different neurodiversities have different strengths, and that you can give them the ability to lean into those strengths. Just a quick example, calling back to the aphantasia that I talked about a little bit earlier. The obvious constraint of that, right, is that I can't call pictures into my mind. Anytime there was any sort of art project that I had to do, I was well and truly bad at it, particularly if I didn't have the thing I was supposed to be drawing or making art from right in front of me to reference. But it did have several strengths as well. It means that I'm particularly strong at thinking in words and abstract concepts. I'm comfortable with things sort of being nebulous and ill-defined as I work through them. I tend to iterate very quickly on things, particularly when I'm working in a digital medium. Because I can't visualize the thing in my head, I have to get it on screen and just work with it very quickly. And so I go through lots and lots of drafts and make lots of adjustments very quickly, rather than sort of spinning my wheels on one thing in my mind. So that's just kind of an example of how we reframe thinking of neurodiversity as strengths-based rather than just focusing on shoring up weaknesses that individuals might have. So we'll talk about three broad categories of neurodiversity today. These are sort of the big three that get mentioned a lot. And obviously there are many more categories and types of neurodiversity. But the big three, And there are generally sort of about 16 to 20% of people who have some sort of specific neurodiverse diagnosed condition. About 10% of people have dyslexia, about 4% of people have ADHD, about 1% of people have are somewhere on the autism spectrum disorder or the autism disorder spectrum. And now those numbers might not sound like a lot all the time, but when we're talking about large groups of people, sort of even 1% can be a significant number. And keep in mind, again, these are only sort of the primary categories. There are, and only the people who have an official diagnosis. It's not unlikely due to the often personal and sort of invisible nature of a lot of neurodiverse conditions that there's a lot of people that have these things and don't even know about it. And this is all stuff we're always continually learning about and uncovering more information about all the time. It's almost certain that there are people who have neurodiverse conditions, think and process the world in ways that we don't even really understand or know about yet. And as if that weren't enough, people with neurodiverse conditions, and often as a result of their different brain layout and structure, often have what we call our comorbid conditions, or different disorders that also take up valuable mental and physical resources and stamina to deal with. For example, if we just look at individuals with ADHD, approximately 2/3 of them are likely to have some sort of comorbidity that goes along with ADHD. 34% of them have anxiety, 29% have depression, 12% have bipolar disorder, 11% have Tourette's disorder, and the list goes on and on and on. And that's just one example. That's just ADHD. And those first two numbers bring another piece of the puzzle into the play. While they aren't technically classified under the umbrella of neurodiverse conditions, mental health issues share a large comorbidity with them. So as we're designing, it's also important that we take steps to help individuals who might be dealing with mental health issues like depression, like anxiety. Unlike neurodiversity, however, I didn't really come across a lot of research or a lot of information around dealing with and approaching mental health issues from a strengths-based perspective. That doesn't mean it's not there, I just didn't find it. But given that at least about 30% of all adults will experience mental health problems at some point during their lifetime, it's definitely worth considering in our design process as well. And just before we get into the strengths, I want to recognize that there are some challenges that a lot of people with neurodiversity face. One common way of looking at it that came out of the neurodiverse community is this idea of spoons theory. This came about back in 2003. Essentially, it uses spoons as a metaphor for the amount of energy that a person has to sort of go about their day and think about and complete the tasks that they need to get done. Anything you do takes a spoon. Get up out of bed and get ready for work, that takes a spoon. Answer your emails properly, that's a spoon. Prepare and eat a healthy lunch, another spoon. Write a paper, that's 2 spoons. You get the idea. Basically, we all have to ration our energy and our productivity and our mental processes throughout the day, and our spoons get recharged through rest. And sort of the foundational idea of spoon theory is that it embraces neurodiversity by understanding 2 things. First is that some people just start the day with fewer spoons than other people, and that can vary from day to day. If you didn't get a good night's sleep the night before, you're probably starting Monday morning with down a couple spoons. If you suffer from something like chronic insomnia or depression or ADHD, you're probably starting the day just with fewer spoons because it takes you more, you just have less resources to draw upon. And then different activities take different amounts of spoons for different people. For one person, for example, sitting down and watching an hour-long lecture might take up 1 spoon out of their day. For an individual with ADHD who really has to sit and try to focus really hard through that video and manage other distractions in their life, that same activity might take 2, 3, or even more spoons. So it might take up more of their energy and take more effort for them to get through the task. So given that neurodiversity affects a wide range of people with a wide range of conditions, with a wide range of comorbidities, and the understanding that we can't really possibly design a single solution that works for everyone, how do we possibly approach it? The broad answer is with a framework called Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. What UDL does is it takes that understanding that we're all different and that we all learn differently and applies it to the design of the learning experience in sort of 3 key areas. First is in motivation and engagement. How do we get our students interested and engaged in the learning experience? A lot of this focuses around your communication strategy. How often are you touching base with your students? What mediums do you use to communicate? How do you reach out to them and how do you help them if they're struggling? Next is content and delivery. How do you present the content? Are you using primarily one type of resource? Is your course all text? Is it all video? Do you include interactive elements? What types of other media are you using? Are you presenting your content in easy to manage chunks? Are you scaffolding the learning to allow learners to learn foundational concepts first and then build up to higher order concepts? And then assessment and expression. Are you giving students multiple ways to demonstrate mastery of the content they've learned? Or is everything just a test and a paper? What types of projects can they engage in? Can they create different types of media? Can they go out in the community and do projects? Can they create a physical artifact and get feedback on that artifact? And so while you can't create the perfect course or the perfect learning experience for all neurodiverse individuals, having a variety of engagement styles, content types, and ways to demonstrate mastery can go a long way to not only removing barriers to those individuals who are neurodiverse, but giving them ways to lean into their strengths as well. And so let's get into some of those individual conditions and strengths. And starting with ADHD, we mentioned earlier that about 4% of the population has ADHD. And for college students, that range is a little bit wider. It ranges between about 2 and 8%. I mean, what ADHD is it's a neurological condition, basically that results in decreased inability to inhibit motor function and decreased ability to inhibit emotional reactivity, as well as problems sort of regulating problem solving, planning, and reasoning. A lot of times this manifests in things like short attention spans for non-preferred tasks, hyperactivity, impulsivity, fidgeting, poor time management, distractibility, procrastination. But the interesting thing here is, is that we can reframe a lot of those words that might have negative connotations and very easily turn them into strengths. Hyperactivity can easily become vitality. Distractibility becomes divergent thinking. Impulsivity becomes spontaneity. And these are all things that we see in a much more positive light, and in fact are all key qualities of what we would describe as highly creative individuals. And the research backs this up too. There was a recent study at U of M where a group of students, half of whom had been diagnosed with ADHD and the other half who had not, were given a battery of creative tests. And in just about every metric, the students with ADHD scored higher on the creativity tests, particularly when it came to brainstorming and idea generation. Learners with ADHD are also generally more playful. They're more imaginative. They're more curious about the world around them. So how can you design into these strengths and help shore up some of the weaknesses in your learning experience? Here's a few thoughts. Deliver content in shorter, more well-defined chunks. This allows ADHD learners to sort of flex their natural strengths of moving from one item to another without asking them to focus on one thing for a really long time. Build assignments and assessments that allow learners to be creative and imaginative. Let them employ what they're working on in real life contexts and situations, whether that's in their workplace, in their family life, in other classes. Try to help them find ways to make things applicable. Provide hands-on tactile learning experiences. Give them things they can touch and manipulate and sort of interact with in a concrete way. Give prompt and timely feedback. Obviously, we always try to give prompt and timely feedback with whatever we're doing, but this is especially important for learners with ADHD. And to go along with it, help them manage their time. Provide estimated completion times for content. Timestamp videos and say, hey, this video is 5 minutes long. Expect to do 15 minutes of reading for this piece of content. Expect to spend maybe between 5 and 7 hours completing this individual assignment. If they're taking a test, give them reminders of how much time they have left. Provide lots of novel experiences, change things up a little bit, even if it's just the environment. It's nice outside, and we get back to face-to-face instruction, have class outside occasionally, do a walking lecture, but also where possible, establish some routines and consistency, just so they can be familiar with, okay, quizzes are always going to be on Fridays, exams are going to be worth 100 points, etc., stuff like that. So next is dyslexia. And dyslexia is a little bit misunderstood. Oftentimes we kind of think of it as just, well, students maybe have trouble reading, or that they see the words or letters differently on the page, that a lowercase letter B also looks like a lowercase letter D, that they sort of get those words confused. Or they see the word saw, S-A-W, as the word was, W-A-S. They sort of transpose those letters around. But that's not really quite an accurate description. What dyslexia actually is it's more of a processing differentiation in the brain. The dyslexic person sees the words correctly, but they struggle to sort of decode and manipulate that language. For example, if you start with the word cat and remove the C, what word would you have? You obviously have the word at that point. A person with dyslexia would struggle more with that type of language manipulation, particularly when it comes to deconstructing and manipulating longer words. They have to break those words down into individual parts or syllables to help them process them, which slows down reading. This obviously makes assignments with large amounts of text or things like reading out loud to a group challenging for dyslexics. But they do have a wide variety of strengths as well. They are often natural and very gifted storytellers with a good memory for narrative. Like individuals with ADHD, they're often very imaginative and creative. They have excellent puzzle solving skills and spatial reasoning. And somewhat counterintuitively, they're often excellent communicators, because while they might not be great at words on a page, they're often excellent at sort of reading people and empathizing with people, which makes them wonderful in conversations. And they're also very good at dealing with abstract concepts and ill-defined ideas. So how do you help design for the dyslexic in your classroom? The first and most obvious answer is to offer text alternatives wherever you can. Rather than having them read several journal articles, ask, is there a way that you can present this information in an audio, a video, or an interactive form? Where you do have to have a lot of reading, use plain language wherever possible. Eliminate a lot of sort of jargon and specialized terms if you can. If you do present text, try not to use stark white on black text, or if you do that, make the text large, because oftentimes sort of closely cramped text like that can make the processing and the breaking up of those words more difficult. Adding in visuals to aid in things like navigation, so pairing things like icons with text can also be very beneficial. Oh, and there we go. But there's also a lot you can do in designing your assignments in your course and your lectures. Structure your lessons around narrative and story. Maybe there are key things happening in the world that you can hook into, or there's a personal anecdote or story you can tell that's relevant to the content you're teaching. This is going to allow dyslexics to remember that information more clearly. Give problem-based or project-based assignments, something that they can really sink their teeth into over the long term. Give them lots of opportunities to talk and communicate, and give them opportunities to listen as well, and sort of flex their communication and their empathy skills in ways outside of written communication, which can often be challenging in an online course, because online courses are often very text-based and very heavy. So implementing different areas or different methods of doing discussion boards, like doing video responses, can be a good thing for dyslexics, those types of things. And then last, I want to talk about autism here. And there's, I'll be the first to admit that an in-depth sort of understanding and study of autism is something that's still in progress for me. There's a lot of information out there. It's not something that I've spent a ton of time on in the past, but there are some key pieces of information and strategies that I think we can use to design more inclusive experiences. Autism is kind of a difficult category of neurodiversity to define. I mean, in fact, it's so broad that the most recent revision of the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, sort of the psychology Bible when we're talking about diagnosing neurodiverse conditions, grouped a bunch of conditions that were in the previous iteration, separate things, into one large category called autism spectrum disorders. And regardless of their place on a spectrum, there are sort of key things that a person with autism might have. They might have issues dealing with issues with speech and articulation, issues perceiving the emotional state of other people, issues processing information, and particularly multitasking. But all of these things come with strengths as well. Individuals with autism often show an exceptional level, an exceptional attention to detail. So much so that they often perceive details that other people will miss. They're the Where's Waldo experts of the world. They can be very direct and efficient. They're very knowledgeable and often have sort of an encyclopedic knowledge of things that they are very interested in. They're good at seeing and sort of thinking in and creating systems. So there's lots of things you can do in your classroom to help them. Provide clear operationalized instructions, because they're very good at processes and systems. Laying things out in a clear step-by-step systemic order can be very helpful. Even things that you might not consider need to be spelled out, like make sure you do this reading or watch this video before completing the assignment. Spelling those types of things out can be very helpful. Oftentimes, learners with autism might prefer interacting through technology. Since they struggle to pick up on nonverbal and social cues, things like interacting through email or through the learning management system give them sort of one less thing that they have to worry about, and gives them the opportunity to really focus on their learning. So something that we would often consider a barrier, the sort of lack of direct interaction or direct communication, to them is often a benefit. And you can look for ways to allow them to engage their interests whatever your subject matter is. Let them connect the projects or assignments in your class to whatever their interests are. As long as it still relates to the learning outcomes that you've laid out, don't be particularly inflexible or rigid in saying an assignment has to be on this particular topic. I mean, the other thing is to give them time to work alone. Overly social situations can often be stressful for learners with autism. Obviously, group work and collaboration are a part of sort of all learning and work experiences, but if you can give them opportunities to sort of retreat and work on their own wherever you can, that's going to be helpful for them as well. Now let's talk a little bit about mental health, because there are so many comorbidities with neurodiverse learners. By far, the two most common mental health challenges in America are anxiety and depression. Anxiety affects about 18% of the adult population in some form or another. Only about 40% of those people actually receive treatment for it. And for depression, what the DSM-5 classifies as major depressive disorder affects about 7% of the population. So anxiety can be triggered by a wide variety of events, but often it manifests in situations that involve making decisions about something or making a judgment about something. And so obviously the way that manifests in the learning experience is oftentimes in exams and tests. They end up being some of the biggest sources of anxiety. So how can you mitigate that? Two main ways. One is to help the learner prepare, and not just prepare for the content on the test, for the things that they're going to be evaluated on, but also the conditions and the structure of the test. How much time are they going to have to complete it? Is the test divided into individual sections? What sections should they expect would take the most time? How many points is each item on the test worth? Knowing this information ahead of time can do a lot to reduce individual anxiety. The other thing you can do is lower the stakes of the test where you can. Rather than doing just one large final exam at the end of the semester, use smaller drill and practice style quizzes and assessments throughout the course. These lower stakes assessments can not only help reinforce the material, but it can get the student and the learner used to the types of questions you like to ask, how your exams and tests are structured. This familiarity can do a lot to help reduce anxiety as well. Obviously, also the fact that each individual quiz isn't worth 50% of their grade reduces anxiety by the fact that there's just not a strong possibility of such a negative outcome from one quiz. You can also do things like providing multiple attempts on a quiz or exam, or allowing students to submit papers and projects multiple times for revision and feedback. This is one thing that my graduate program does exceptionally well, is it's all project-based. And for every assignment we do, we're allowed to submit it 3, 4, 5 times. As long as everything's done by the end of the course, we can continue revising it as much as we'd like to meet the criteria and meet the expectations of the course, which does a lot to not only reinforce learning, but help anxiety. You don't just have the sort of one and done, oh, well, I turned it in and I better hope I did well on it. And depression can also severely impact learning. People with depression might feel discouraged, overwhelmed, frustrated, even completely hopeless that they can't learn the material. A few things that can help is just making sure your course design is clean and simple and not overcluttered. People with depression, a lot of their cognitive budget, a lot of their spoons are taken up with just kind of getting through the day and trying to do what they can. So they don't have a lot of extra cognitive budget for dealing with complex navigation or a lot of extraneous material in the course. So really sort of emphasize clarity and readability and structure. Just giving students the opportunities within your course to connect with you, to connect with other students. Sometimes just having that human connection can be something that really helps someone out, and reaching out to them how they are comfortable, whether they want to be contacted via text message or phone call or email, just sort of finding out what works for them and working within those frameworks. And then being gracious where you can about deadlines. Offer flexibility and extensions where possible. Obviously, there's a limit to that, but just giving people a little bit of extra time when they need it can really help reduce those feelings of being overwhelmed or frustrated or hopeless. And obviously, so this all sounds like a lot. There's a lot of different things you can do in your courses for a wide variety of neurodiverse learners. So how do you approach it in a way that's manageable rather than trying to overhaul all of your courses at once to make all these changes? There's a piece of universal design that we call +1 thinking. And really all it is just looking at areas in your course where you might be able to add one more way of engaging with the learner, or one more different way of presenting the content, or one different way that they can demonstrate mastery, and sort of adding these piecemeal one at a time to sort of build up a library and a more universally designed course as you go through it. And it's an iterative process. You don't do it all at once. You sort of do it each time you run the course, maybe add one or two more things. And a good way of looking at it is to kind of look at areas where there might be pain points in your course. Where are students struggling the most? Where are they maybe having problems understanding directions on assignments? Where are they not understanding concepts that I'm trying to teach? Where are maybe grades not where I would expect them to be? And those are sort of prime areas to look to apply this sort of +1 thinking of, okay, maybe I'm going to add one other type of resource here, and then just run the course again, see how that works, and then you'll likely find other areas where you can continue to improve. So that's what I've got for you. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts that they would like to share? Oh, I see we have some stuff in the chat here that I did not have open while I was let's see. Yeah, the word counts to the time estimator tools for reading. Do you happen to know, David, what the names of some of those tools are, the reading estimator tools?
I can add a couple links in the chat.
That would be fantastic. And there are also some tools built into Canvas that aren't necessarily like estimators, but can help present some of the content in multiple ways as well. There's the Microsoft Immersive Reader that just got added to Canvas that can really help readers, if you've created pages in Canvas, to limit their distractions, sort of help them to focus on one word or one line at a time. Anybody else have anything they would like to share or questions?
Hey, this is Chris. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, just because I don't usually use my phone for this, so I'm not sure if I did it right or not. So I have a question and a comment.
Okay.
So the first one is the question on why are they called comorbidities? It just sounds just like that, so morbid, and it doesn't seem like these neurodivergent learners are on a path to death. So I'm just curious why that term is used, not something more positive or less stigma.
That's a great question. The term is sort of, it's really a medical term. And so when they're talking about, right, I don't know why it's also used for neurodiversity and why we use it in sort of the context of talking about mental illness with neurodiversity. It's just kind of the term that's always been used. If there's another term that is out there, I would love to know about it, because you're absolutely right. Like it's
Yeah.
not the most friendly sounding term in the world. And it certainly doesn't give the
No,
connotation that we want of because oftentimes you're right,
Okay.
these conditions aren't like, hey, they're not on a path to death.
yeah. Well, it just seemed to me like a lot of these suggestions not only benefit the learners that we're concerned about, but just other students who might not have those same divergent learning methods, it would still benefit them to have a video in addition to text or all these other options. So it sounded almost more like a positive way to, I just kept thinking there's got to be a nicer way. But anyway, that was my question. But my comment was this idea of +1, this adding a +1 thinking to your class. The second time I heard this today, so I heard it in a podcast earlier this morning. And it's just something I wish I had heard before, because I think I operate on the +10 mentality, which is very exhausting. So, you know, just knowing +1 or +2 each time I do a class, I think that would be a much more, you know, friendly way to me, but also improve the class. So I just appreciated you reiterating the +1 idea too.
You are most welcome. Yeah. +1 thinking is great. And there's actually, I can send you, there's Tom Tobin, one of the guys who is talks a lot about universal design for learning and is sort of one of the thought leaders in the area, came up with this idea of basically sort of approaching universal design concepts from basically a Chinese menu. So you basically just have a list of like, here are all the different things you can do and just pick one. And if you're interested, I can send you that handout. It's really great because it basically lists out, here's all the things you can do. Here's about how much time you could expect it to take to implement. And then you just pick the ones you want to do.
Interesting.
So
yeah.
I can definitely send that along. Oh, Michelle, that's a great comment. Michelle says, rather than using comorbidity, using co-occurring conditions. I like that a lot more.
Interesting. Yeah, I heard it. It was in Advancing Online Teaching, the book out by Todd Zakrajisk and Kevin Kelly. And so they mentioned it in their interview about their book. It was just interesting because I was like, that's a great thing. Like, why, you know, like we tell our students do one thing at a time, but I thought I had to do 100, you know, so I just appreciate that as well.
You're welcome. I'm glad you found that helpful. If you're looking for other materials and other resources around sort of universal design and +1 thinking, there's a book called Universal Design for Learning in Higher Education, called Reach Everyone, Teach Everyone, which is absolutely fantastic, that I would highly recommend to everyone, really. Anybody have anything else they want to share?
Great job, Dave.
Thank you. All right. Well, if there is nothing else, everybody have a good afternoon. And thank you for coming.